In 1934, Shih-I Hsiung wrote and co-directed the play Lady Precious Stream, which ran for the next 2 years in over 900 performances on the Strand, in the West End of London, and another 200 performances on Broadway in New York, thrusting Shih-I into the limelight. 50 years later, I met and married Shih-I's granddaughter, Joanna, and 30 years after that, we spent a week in the UK in tribute to Shih-I Hsiung. We started with Uncle Dada, the fifth of Shih-I's 6 children, born in 1932.
我特别高兴能看到您，是因为让我想起爷爷，因为您太像爷爷了。我有时候还梦见爷爷，我总感觉到好像他还生活在我们身边。也许看了您就觉得您特像爷爷。你认为？
是很多人在见到我，他说：“Oh, Mr. Hsiung, how do you manage to look so young?"
Uncle Dada recalls his father.
He's very small, even smaller than me, but his personality is like a giant.
他的阳光是因为他总是把什么事都看得挺乐的，而且他挺助乐帮人的，是吗？
My earliest memory of him was when he returned to China in either 35 or 36, I think.
By then, Shih-I was famous. Mei Lanfang was his good friend and greeted him on his return to Shanghai. Shih-I and his wife, Cai Daimei, took their 3 oldest children, Delan, Devei, and Deni, back with them to Britain. But it was not until 1950 that Dehai and Deda left China.
When we got to London, I also remember Uncle Ho drove us to Paddington Station, got on the train. And by then, it's getting dark, I think it's 4 o'clock. My father got out his watch. He said, "We'll be arriving in 3 minutes." That remark made me realize how westernized my father has become.
Uncle Ho, who picked up Deda and Dehai at the station, was a diplomat at the Republic of China Embassy in London. We met his daughter, Grace, in the Savoy Theatre, where, in 1936, Lady Precious Stream had played for 225 performances.
It was my parents, actually. They knew Uncle and Auntie Hsiung, I call them Uncle and Auntie in the Chinese way, in China. I grew up with Dei Hsiung. I was born in 1939, and Dei Hsiung was born 1940. Well, Auntie Hsiung played mahjong with my mother. Uncle Hsiung was a kind of a more imposing guy on the fringes, like my father, you know. But usually I stayed with him. Auntie Hsiung was there. I can barely remember Uncle Hsiung at that point.
Joining us at the Savoy Theatre was Grace Lau's good friend Diana Ye, a sociologist, historian, and writer of Shih-I's biography published in 2014, The Happy Hsiungs, Performing China and the Struggle for Modernity.
Well, I was concerned by the cultural invisibility, really, of the Chinese in Britain. They've mainly worked as seafarers or launderers or caterers in the takeaway business, and there's no idea that actually they're very much involved in the broader cultural and social and political life of Britain. And that's when I started doing some research on early Chinese artists and writers. And I was fortunate enough to be friends with Grace, and I mentioned to her that I was trying to find out about this person called Shih-I Hsiung, because I had found his Lady Precious Stream in SOAS Library, but I couldn't find anything more about this man at all. And she just turned around to me and said, "Oh, the Hsiungs, well, I know their family, and I'll introduce you to Data, their son."
Data, or Deda as it's pronounced in Chinese, reflects on the extraordinary success of Lady Precious Stream.
But it just happened. This there's a very small theater. I suppose it's like the fringe theater called the Little Theater in the Strand, and the producer, Nancy Price, I think is her name, she took a gamble. And somehow it appears the critics like it.
The leading critic of the Sunday Times, James Agate, wrote on December 2nd, 1934, "Of the 4 plays which I've seen this week, Lady Precious Stream is easily the best. One has but to cock an eye at this little Chinese fantasy to recognize that respect in which it towers over everything else on the London stage at the moment. It is all perfectly simple, convincing, and satisfying. The piece seemed to me to be extremely well acted, and perhaps whether the Chinese would agree is not the point. The very distinguished company at the little theatre pretends very amusingly to be non-English, and that at least an orientation towards China is skillfully suggested. The real question, of course, is how does Miss Price do it? By what enchantment is such a galaxy gathered together?" We drove to Brighton to meet Nancy Price's granddaughter, Sarah Dunsmuir, who pointed out her grandmother in the only photo that we could find with both Nancy Price and Shih-I Hsiung, and who kindly gave us permission to photocopy artifacts from Nancy Price's archives in Chichester. And in those archives was a letter dated 18th May, 1935, from Queen Mary, thanking Nancy Price for constructing a private box in the little theatre, a theatre that had no private boxes, to allow the Queen to view discreetly Lady Precious Stream. We visited a Cambridge scholar of Chinese history, Professor Michael Lowy, who remembers the fame of Lady Precious Stream from his youth.
We went to Nancy Price's granddaughter's house, and she had a good picture of her grandma with Queen Mary.
And that is something, because photographs of kings and queens in those days, they were not all that popular. They weren't so frequent.
Queen Mary saw the play again, several times in fact, at the larger and more opulent Savoy Theatre, in the comfort of her private box. The Savoy, in the west end of the Strand, is just 100 metres or so north of the old Little Theatre site. Opened in 1881, the Savoy was the first public building in the world to be entirely lit by electricity. In 1990, after a fire, the Savoy was restored as faithfully as possible to its 1929 designs. Lady Precious Stream was published and republished in several versions. The editor of the Methuen Modern Classic Version, its 5th edition in 1937, noted how suitable it was for private or school productions. Many schools over the next 2 decades performed it. Diana Yeh reflects on why Lady Precious Stream was successful, not only in the West End in the 1930s, but in theatre groups throughout Britain and around the world, and in school performances through the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s.
One part of it is the universality of the play. I think it was a love story, a very simple love story, and simple to the extent that it could be adapted for local audiences very easily. China has often acted as a kind of a blank screen for whichever country to project their fantasies and ideas and images onto. And I think in that sense, Lady Precious Stream again was this kind of like very simple blank screen that could be manipulated, adapted for very different political motives often.
Notwithstanding this adaptability, one of the selling points of Lady Precious Stream in the 1930s was its authenticity. Initially, Shih-I Hsiung emphasized that it was an old Chinese play which he had merely translated. As he said in the foreword to the original edition, "In this play I have not attempted in the least to alter anything." The most recent adaptation of Lady Precious Stream was in December 2011, when the University of Reading put on a full production. We visited the director of that production, Professor Ashley Thorpe, in his office at Royal Holloway, west of London. Ashley's research concerns performance forms from East Asia. He's an expert in Chinese opera, and when he discovered Lady Precious Stream, he was very keen to find out how Chinese opera could have been brought successfully to the West End of London in the 1930s. He followed his research by putting on the play.
We have a tradition, I don't know if you're aware of this, a film called Carry On films. Yes, And basically, so this is like Carry On Chinese opera.
The play tells the story of the daughter of the Prime Minister, who marries a poor but valiant man, Xue Pinggui, against her father's wishes. The young couple moves into a cave, but Xue Pinggui is conscripted into the army. Lost in battle against the people of the western regions, he returns 18 years later as the king of the western regions to reclaim his wife, Precious Stream, and to exact revenge. But his wife does not recognize him. Then he gives her her own letter that she sent to him.
Well, this is the letter.
Then why do you close the door again?
Well, I will open it on one condition.
What is your condition, please?
Take one step backwards.
All right. I have done so.
And another step, please.
All right. Now open the door and let me in.
Just one more step.
I can't. I've come to the end of things.
If you had not come to the end of things, you would not be back here with me.
We can compare Shih-I's play with the opera on which it was based. Here is the same section from 红鬃烈马 as performed by CCTV's Heilongjiang Air Theatre.
再退后一步。还要你退后一步。哎呀去呀！后面我有路了。后面若是有路，你也不回来了。
And to think that after 18 long years' separation, you insult me the moment you meet me. What is there to live for? I'd rather die than take back such a man.
Oh, please don't say that. I entreat you forgive me.
No.
The plot remains the same, but the jokes are adjusted for British
No, I'm
audiences.
paying my highest respects to you in the presence of an audience.
No. You said you were on your knees. What about your other knee?
Oh, I beg your pardon.
And of course, 红鬃烈马 was an opera.
But he kept some of the essence of the story, because, you know, he changed pretty much everything else. So, I mean, obviously it was an opera, but then it became transposed into a Western-style play, complete with just, you know, spoken play with no music, or very little music. He changed the costumes. He changed part of the story as well, to modernise it for British audiences.
Not everyone in the British audiences raved about Lady Precious Stream. Shih-I's friend, the great Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw, whose works Shih-I had translated into Chinese before moving to Britain, called Lady Precious Stream just a tuppenny-halfpenny melodrama. Shih-I unconditionally agreed with his friend's assessment, and to show that Chinese drama was excellent, he chose the 13th century play The Romance of the Western Chamber. Using the private library of Sir James Lockhart, the former colonial secretary to Hong Kong, he spent a year meticulously translating The Romance of the Western Chamber. George Bernard Shaw approved. The Sunday Times review was positive but restrained. There is less of the almost boisterous fun that delights us in Precious Stream. Ashley Thorpe comments on some of that boisterous fun.
Is it insulting towards Chinese culture? Maybe. But at the same time, I think there's also a sense in which Hsiung is laughing at British actors unable to comprehend that what they're doing isn't right.
But not everyone was laughing. Hong Shen, a Tsinghua University scholar, 8 years older than Shih-I, was the first Chinese to have written and directed a play in the West in English. In 1936, writing in the Shanghai left-wing monthly periodical Guangming, he was scathing. Lady Precious Stream pandered to Western elitism. It reinforced the cultural biases against China. It distorted a classical Chinese piece, and it completely ignored the plight of China, invaded by Japan in the 1930s. He called on Hsiung to use his new fame for the good of China. S.I. was already doing so. A prominent member of the China Campaign Committee and a Chinese delegate to the Rassemblement Universel pour la Paix, S.I. spoke on dozens of occasions around Britain to mobilize the British to support China in its struggle against the Japanese invasion. When S.I.'s friend, with whom he had shared a house in Hampstead, the communist professor and poet Shelley Wang-Li-Si, returned to China to join the fight against the Japanese invaders, S.I. appealed to the famous British writer H.G. Wells for support. And when Shelley Wang died at the front, S.I. joined the travel writer Jiangxi, with whom S.I. and Shelley Wang had also shared their flat in Hampstead, in mourning Shelley's death. S.I.'s play, The Professor from Peking, published in 1939 and performed on the London stage shortly afterwards, plunged the London audiences into the turmoil and strife of 20th century China. But this time, the critics were not impressed. As James Agate wrote in the Sunday Times, Mr. Hsiung proclaims the intention of presenting the modern Chinese as he really is, and not as the English stage has hitherto conceived him. Nothing could be more laudable. But what Mr. Hsiung had failed to ask himself is whether he knows the English audiences sufficiently to make his authenticities amusing. The plot, dealing with the shadowy politics of a much too far East, was almost completely incomprehensible, even if we grasped whatever there was to grasp. The infantilism of the precedent comic relief had killed the play stone dead. Although S.I. failed in dramatizing modern China on the stage, 4 years later his novel Bridge of Heaven succeeded. Set in early 20th century China, Bridge of Heaven is the story of Dathong, a poor but honest, bright, hard-working fisherman's son adopted into a wealthy household. Set in S.I.'s home province of Jiangxi, it is the story of revolution and reaction, of poverty and wealth, of pride, shame, hope, and love, of East and West confrontation, conflict, and synthesis, and of the rise of the Republic of China. The book's foreword included a poem by John Masefield, the Poet Laureate of Britain. Bridge of Heaven enjoyed 11 reprintings in 3 years. Among the pieces S.I. wrote for the People's National Theatre magazine, edited by Nancy Price, was a short play suitable, like Lady Precious Stream, for school performances. Mencius was a bad boy. Based on the old saying, Meng Mu San Qian, Mencius' mother moved 3 times, it was the story of how a poor mother's devotion to her son's upbringing led her to move house so that her son would receive a good education. S.I.'s wife, Cai Daimei, Daimei Hsiung, in her fictionalized account of her life in Britain, Flowering Exile, describes how she moved the Hsiung family first from Hampstead in London to St. Albans and finally to Oxford. We were unable to find the house in Hampstead because it was destroyed in the bombing during the Second World War after the family had left. But we did visit the house where Daimia, S.I., Delan, Devei, Denis, and Dei lived on Iffley Turn, south of Oxford. Greg Birdseye, the head of the Iffley History Society, published a booklet about the house and its famous residents, and he showed us a picture of S.I. teaching his youngest daughter, Dei, calligraphy. We went to Cambridge, where S.I. was on faculty from 1950 to 1953. Records at the archives confirmed his appointment, his salary, his distinction of being only the 2nd ethnic Chinese hired by the university, and his address. We visited the house where he lived at 46 Eden Street. but by the time S.I. lived there, his family was no longer together. De and De stayed in Britain. De Lan, De Wei, De Ni, and De Hai returned to help build New China. S.I.'s politics had shifted to the right. With the help of both his former schoolmate, Admiral Guiyongqing, military attaché to the Chinese embassy in Britain, and the ambassador, Guo Taiqi, S.I. had researched and written an English biography of Generalissimo Jiangxi. The biography was published in 1948, 1 year before the Generalissimo lost the Chinese Civil War and Mao Zedong took power as the chairman of the Communist Party to found the People's Republic of China. After teaching at Cambridge, S.I. left Britain for the U.S., Singapore, and Hong Kong, helping Lin Yutang to establish Nanyang University, working in film, writing, co-founding Tsinghua College in Hong Kong, and keeping strong connections with intellectuals in Taiwan, and, in the last years of his life, returning to Beijing. During those 3 decades in Britain, the last years of the empire, S.I. had done what no Chinese had done before. A classically educated Chinese scholar, he made his name as an English-language author, playwright, director, activist, and lecturer. Lady Precious-Stream, in London's West End, had entertained Queen Mary, and on New York's Broadway, Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the President of the United States. The play had captured the imagination of critics, writers, academics, and common people. Soon after I met S.I.'s granddaughter Joanna, my father, Alan Thomas, told me of his vivid memory of Shih-I Hsiung in 1936, when, 80 years ago, my Uncle Jeff had taken my father to see Lady Precious-Stream. S.I., the only Chinese on stage, was the honorable reader, the narrator of the play. S.I. had reached the top of Western and Chinese societies. His children had graduated from Oxford and had distinguished careers in their chosen fields. At a time when my Uncle Jeff and my father Alan were traveling to China to be medical doctors in mission hospitals in North and South China to bridge the gap between East and West, S.I. had bridged that same gap in the West End of London and the West Side of New York. But the most precious gift that I received from S.I. was Joanna, through whom flows the spirit of S.I. 30 years after our wedding, 80 years after S.I.'s success, we went to Britain and to the Savoy Theatre stage to celebrate S.I.'s life and work, his genius, his geniality, his drive, his love.